The initial trigger that brought about this whole catastrophe was through American trained, armed and funded rebels, many of which had just been shipped over from doing the same in Libya.
12 hours you had me outside Parliament the other day when they were debating Syria, and the day before that, 6 hours in the pissing cold in Paris for the climate talks. The climate talks. Did you use any of that footage, Tim? No, of course you didn't. Fuck the planet. There's a war on! I'm not full of cold. I'm full of news. It's coming out of every orifice. It's coming out I'm sweating the news, Tim. Oh. Oh, I'm so sorry. I just flobbed some news out. I did a greener of news. Let's look at the greener of news. Oh, it's good news. Round 1 to the junior doctors. Ding ding. Well done. Bad news here. We are at war, and it's probably Jeremy Corbyn's fault because he fucking loves the terrorists, doesn't he? Which brings me on to another bit of news that I just thought of. Let's look at this bit of news. Oh, this is news to me. According to David Cameron, I'm a terrorist sympathiser just because I don't 100% agree with bombing Syria.
I'm not going to fight another election as your leader, so I don't have the luxury of unlimited time. And let me tell you, I am in just as much of a hurry as I was 5 years ago. Securing our country, growing our economy, jobs, exports, growth, infrastructure. These are, of course, the stepping stones on the path to greatness for our country. My friends, we cannot let that man inflict his security-threatening, terrorist-sympathising, Britain-hating ideology on this country we love.
For all members, taking a decision that will put British servicemen and women in harm's way and almost inevitably lead to the deaths of innocents is a heavy responsibility. It must be treated with the utmost seriousness and respect given to those who make a different judgment about the right course of action to take. Which is why the Prime Minister's attempt to brand those who plan to vote against the government as terrorist sympathisers both demeans the office of the Prime Minister and, I believe, undermines the seriousness of the deliberations we're having today.
That is my Prime Minister's assessment of my character.
So apparently, anyone that disagrees with Cameron about bombing the Syrians is a terrorist sympathiser.
So will you apologise for the remarks in a meeting last night against right honourable friends on this side of the House?
Well, I couldn't be clearer in my opening remarks. I respect people who disagree.
Let me say right here, no more passive tolerance. No more passive tolerance. No more passive tolerance in Britain.
It would be helpful if he could retract his inappropriate comments from last night.
I completely agree with the honourable gentleman. Everyone in this House should make up their mind on the arguments in this House.
I cannot identify a single terrorist sympathiser among that list. Will he now apologise for his deeply insulting remarks?
No more passive tolerance in Britain.
I've made very clear this is about how we fight terrorism, and there is honour in any vote that honourable members make.
I do think, however, that he needs to apologise for the comments he made in relation to the Labour Party.
But you ain't no Muslim, bruv.
Should he not take this opportunity to withdraw the remarks that he is calling those who will not be voting with him tonight a bunch of terrorist sympathisers? Because not only is that offensive, it is dangerous and it is untrue.
You ain't no Muslim.
I've made my views clear about the importance of all of us fighting terrorism, and I think it's time to move on.
Will he take this further opportunity to identify which members of these benches he regards as terrorist sympathisers?
But you ain't no Muslim, bruv.
Well, the Prime Minister, he's been asked before, but he must apologise for the slurs that was put on every member of the opposition last night.
We're going to vote either way tonight. Either vote is an honourable vote, but I really do suggest that we get on with the debate that the country wants to hear about.
He now just got up and said, whoever does not walk with me through the division lobby
is not a terrorist sympathiser. He would improve his standing in this House enormously.
You ain't no Muslim.
I think I'm very happy to repeat what she said. As I've said, people who vote in either division lobby, they do so with honour.
Would the Prime Minister now withdraw his remarks in relation to terrorist sympathisers?
What I say is I think everyone is now focused on the main issues in front of us.
If the Prime Minister now wants to apologise for those remarks, I'd be happy to give way to him to do so.
But you ain't no Muslim, bruv.
As he appropriately is pointing out that the Prime Minister is not showing leadership by not withdrawing his slur on me and others, would he also agree with me that there is no place whatsoever in the Labour Party for anybody who has been abusing those members of the Labour Party who choose to vote with the government on this resolution?
Mr. Speaker, abuse has no part in responsible, democratic political dialogue.
Would you agree with me that if the Prime Minister came to that dispatch box and made a clear apology, he would clear the air immediately and we could move on in this debate with a simple "I'm sorry"?
Well, as he often does on these occasions, he appears to be taking advice from the Chancellor of the Exchequer on this matter. If he wants to apologise now, that's fine. If he doesn't, well, the whole world can note that he's not apologising. If the Prime Minister now wants to apologise for those remarks, I'd be happy to give way to him to do so.
How dare David Cameron describe anyone in the anti-war movement as a terrorist sympathiser? Now, I object to this on every conceivable level, but at the most personal level, I condemn this because I have a memory of recent events in the Middle East.
No more passive tolerance in Britain. And that's coming from a man who counts Rebecca Brooks as a close friend, Saudi Arabia as a close business partner. A very good judge of character, is he, really?
Mr. Speaker, since the Prime Minister first made his case for extending British bombing to Syria in the House last week, the doubts and unanswered questions then expressed on both sides of the House have only grown and multiplied. That's why it's a matter of such concern that the government has decided to push this vote through Parliament today. Mr. Speaker, abuse has no part in responsible, democratic political dialogue. That I believe very strongly, and that is the way that I wish to conduct myself, and I wish others to conduct themselves in that way. Yes, I do give way, then I'll move on.
Before I respond to the debate, I would like to say this directly to the Prime Minister. Although my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and I will walk into different division lobbies tonight, I am proud to speak from the same dispatch box as him. My right honourable friend is not a terrorist sympathiser. He is an honest, a principled, a decent and a good man. And I think the Prime Minister must now regret what he said yesterday and his failure to do what he should have done today, which is simply to say, I am sorry.
Since, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is unmoved, we'll have to move on with the debate, and I hope he will be stronger later to recognise that, yes, he did make an unfortunate remark last night, and apologising for it would be very helpful to improve the atmosphere of this debate today. It's impossible, I think, Mr. Speaker, to avoid the conclusion that the Prime Minister understands that public opinion is moving increasingly against what I believe to be an ill-thought-out rush to war. And he wants to hold this vote before the opinion grows even further against it. Whether it's a lack of strategy worth the name, the absence of credible ground troops, the missing diplomatic plan for a Syrian settlement, the failure to address the impact of the terrorist threat or the refugee crisis and civilian casualties, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's proposals for military action simply do not stand.
Now, Mr. Speaker, we have had an intense and impassioned debate, and rightly so, given the clear and present threat from Daesh, the gravity of the decision that rests upon the shoulders and the conscience of every single one of us, and the lives that we hold in our hands tonight. And whatever decision we reach, I hope we will treat one another with respect. Now, we have heard a number of outstanding speeches, and sadly time will prevent me from acknowledging them all. But I would just like to single out the contributions, both for and against the motion. The question which confronts us in a very, very complex conflict is at its heart very simple. What should we do with others to confront this threat to our citizens, our nation, other nations, and the people who suffer under the yoke, the cruel yoke of Daesh? The carnage in Paris brought home to us the clear and present danger we face from them. It could just as easily have been London or Glasgow or Leeds or Birmingham, and it could still be. And I believe that we have a moral and a practical duty to extend the action we are already taking in Iraq to Syria. And I am also clear, and I say this to my colleagues, that the conditions set out in the emergency resolution passed at the Labour Party conference in September have been met. Yeah. We now have a clear and unambiguous UN Security Council resolution 2249, paragraph 5 of which specifically calls on member states to take all necessary measures to redouble and coordinate their efforts to prevent and suppress terrorist acts committed specifically by ISIL, and to eradicate the safe haven they have established over significant parts of Iraq and Syria. So the United Nations is asking us to do something. It is asking us to do something now. It is asking us to act in Syria as well as in Iraq. And it was a Labour government, if the honourable gentleman will bear with me, it was a Labour government that helped to found the United Nations at the end of the Second World War. And why did we do so? Because we wanted the nations of the world working together to deal with threats to international peace and security, and Daesh is unquestionably that. So given that the United Nations has passed this resolution, given that such action would be lawful under Article 51 of the UN Charter, because every state has the right to defend itself, why would we not uphold the settled will of the United Nations, particularly when there is such support from within the region, including from Iraq? We are part of a coalition of over 60 countries, standing together shoulder to shoulder to oppose their ideology and their brutality. Now, Mr. Speaker, all of us understand the importance of bringing an end to the Syrian civil war, and there is now some progress on a peace plan because of the Vienna talks. They are the best hope we have of achieving a ceasefire. Now, that would bring an end to Assad's bombing, leading to a transitional government and elections. And why is that vital? Both because it will help in the defeat of Daesh, and because it would enable millions of Syrians who have been forced to flee to do what every refugee dreams of. They just want to be able to go home. Now, Mr. Speaker, no one in this debate doubts the deadly, serious threat we face from Daesh and what they do, although sometimes we find it hard to live with the reality. We know that in August, the 82-year-old guardian of the antiquities of Palmyra, Professor Khalid al-Assad, was beheaded and his headless body was hung from a traffic light. And we know that in recent weeks there has been the discovery of mass graves in Sinjar, one said to contain the bodies of older Yazidi women murdered by Daesh because they were judged too old to be sold for sex. We know they have killed 30 British tourists in Tunisia, 224 Russian holidaymakers on a plane, 178 people in suicide bombings in Beirut, Ankara and Surat, 130 people in Paris, including those young people in the Bataclan, whom Daesh, in trying to justify their bloody slaughter, called them apostates, engaged in prostitution and vice. If it had happened here, they could have been our children. And we know that they are plotting more attacks. So the question for each of us and for our national security is this: given that we know what they are doing, can we really stand aside and refuse to act fully in our self-defence against those who are planning these attacks? Can we really leave to others the responsibility for defending our national security when it is our responsibility? And if we do not act, what message would that send about our solidarity with those countries that have suffered so much, including Iraq and our ally France? Now, France wants us to stand with them. And President Hollande, the leader of our sister socialist party, has asked for our assistance and help. And as we are undertaking airstrikes in Iraq, where Daesh's hold has been reduced, and we are already doing everything but engage in airstrikes in Syria, should we not play our full part? Now, Mr. Speaker, it has been argued in the debate that airstrikes achieve nothing. Not so. Look at how Daesh's forward march has been halted in Iraq. The House will remember that 14 months ago, people were saying they are almost at the gates of Baghdad, and that is why we voted to respond to the Iraqi government's request for help to defeat them. Look at how their military capacity and their freedom of movement has been put under pressure. Ask the Kurds about Sinjar and Kobani.
I'm glad that he has mentioned the Kurds. Could he be clear at this dispatch box that he or anyone on this bench in no way will want to remove the air protection which was voted on with an overwhelming majority in the House 14 months ago?
I thank my friend for that intervention. It is not part of the motion today, so we move on with this debate.
Look at how their military capacity and their freedom of movement has been put under pressure. Now, of course, airstrikes alone will not defeat Daesh, but they make a difference. Now, on the subject of ground troops to defeat Daesh, there's been much debate about the figure of 70,000, and the government must, I think, better explain that. But we know that most of them are currently engaged in fighting President Assad. But I tell you what else we know, is whatever the number, 70,000, 40,000, 80,000, the current size of the opposition forces mean the longer we leave taking action, the longer Daesh will have to decrease that number. And so to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that airstrikes should not take place until the Syrian civil war has come to an end is, I think, to miss the urgency of the terrorist threat that Daesh poses to us and others, and I think misunderstands the nature and objectives of the extension to airstrikes that is being proposed. And of course we should take action. It is not a contradiction between the two to cut off Daesh's support in the form of money and fighters and weapons, and of course we should give humanitarian aid, and of course we should offer shelter to more refugees, including in this country, and yes, we should commit to play our full part in helping to rebuild Syria when the war is over. Now, I accept that there are legitimate arguments, and we have heard them in the debate, for not taking this form of action now. And it is also clear that many members have wrestled, and who knows, in the time that is left, may still be wrestling with what the right thing to do is. But I say the threat is now, and there are rarely, if ever, perfect circumstances in which to deploy military forces. Now, I share the concerns that have been expressed this evening about potential civilian casualties. However, unlike Daesh, none of us today act with the intent to harm civilians. Now, we heard very powerful testimony from the Honourable Member for Edinburgh earlier when she quoted that passage. And I just want to read what Kawan Jamal Tahir, the Kurdistan Regional Government High Representative in London, said last week, and I quote, "Last June, Daesh captured 1/3 of Iraq overnight, and a few months later attacked the Kurdistan region. Swift airstrikes by Britain, America and France, and the actions of our own Peshmerga saved us. We now have a border of 650 miles with Daesh. We have pushed them back and recently captured Sinjar. Again, Western airstrikes were vital. But the old border between Iraq and Syria does not exist. Daesh fighters come and go across this fictional boundary. And that is the argument, Mr. Speaker, for treating the two countries as one if we are serious about defeating Daesh. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hope the House will bear with me if I direct my closing remarks to my Labour friends and colleagues on this side of the House. As a party, we have always been defined by our internationalism. We believe we have a responsibility one to another. We never have, and we never should, walk by on the other side of the road. And we are here faced by fascists. Not just their calculated brutality, but their belief that they are superior to every single one of us in this chamber tonight and all of the people that we represent. They hold us in contempt. They hold our values in contempt. They hold our belief in tolerance and decency in contempt. They hold our democracy, the means by which we will make our decision tonight, in contempt. And what we know about fascists is that they need to be defeated. And it is why, as we have heard tonight, socialists and trade unionists and others joined the International Brigade in the 1930s to fight against Franco. It's why this entire House stood up against Hitler and Mussolini. It is why our party has always stood up against the denial of human rights and for justice. And my view, Mr. Speaker, is that we must now confront this evil.
I've got no more news, Tim. I've run out of news. There's no news. There's certainly no news about the climate talks, is there? No, of course not, because we've got a war on. We've got to report the war. We've got to report bombs and refugees. And I tell you what, if you think a few thousand camped out in Calais, you think that's a refugee crisis, you wait till climate change really kicks in. Billions fleeing. They'll be fleeing failed crops and famine, and by virtue of that, civil war and extremism like you've never known. It'll be like that film with Brad Pitt with all those zombies, tens of thousands of them, all climbing over each other. They're coming up over the white cliffs of Dover. Everyone in Kent's there with a.
Well, the European Parliament President urges EU leaders to find a way to overcome their division over the refugee crisis and restore security at the borders. Martin Schulz made the comments in the end-of-year gathering of the EU leaders in Brussels. The refugee crisis has been the dominant issue of this year's summit. Concerns over security issues and different financial situations have made it difficult for the European countries to reach a unified policy. Only this year, nearly 1 million refugees arrived at Europe's borders. After months of debate, only 2 of 11 migrant hotspots or reception centres have been set up in Greece and Italy.
Comes along the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, completely unexpected. Europe as a whole loses control of its borders, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people arrive, many of them, not all, but clearly many of them, genuine refugees. Okay? What is happening, of course, is breaking the standard asylum rules, which is that you seek asylum in the first country you get to that's safe, Well, to be fair, I don't think the Greeks and the Italians can cope with this, so I think that's perfectly reasonable, but it breaks the rules. And they, of course, all want to go to stable, rich northern countries with lots of jobs. And Germany is one highly favoured country, but lots of them clearly would like to come to the UK, which has lots of jobs and is reasonably stable and rich. And the British are desperate to keep them out. This is absolutely clear. And the way we can prevent them seeking from asylum is to prevent them ever getting in. And one of the advantages of being in an island is you're relatively easy to do so. Relatively easy. Not perfectly easy, but relatively easy to do so. So the policy has been to say, we are a fortress island, we will not allow any of these people in, and you deal with them, because they got to you first. France, Germany, it's your problem. But that has become politically unmanageable for them, and they've been forced to accept a certain number, which will create many big problems for him. My vision of the future on this is, one, we will be forced to take more. Two, which is right, I'm not complaining, I'm perfectly happy with that. We won't take enormously much more, maybe 50, maybe 60, it's not going to be 200,000 or 300,000. That's just not going to happen. The government will fall over that. The government will fall over that. I'm absolutely no doubt. And our determination to tighten up border controls will increase beyond what it already is, which is very, very substantial indeed. And this is going to create a lot of friction.
The European Commission is proposing a new border patrol force to help secure the bloc's external frontiers in the face of the migrant crisis. The agency is set to replace the current EU border force called Frontex. It's going to have greater manpower and a bigger budget too, of around €280 million. That's twice the current level. Here's where the controversy comes in, though. This new border agency will also be granted the right to intervene at the border of any member state, even without the country's consent. And that's got some states up in arms.
Strengthening Frontex, creating a kind of border guard, would by all means be needed, beneficial. But the way the Commission proposed it, for it to be a structure independent from nation states, is astounding. There'd be an undemocratic structure reporting to no one knows who.
I don't think that would be appropriate to have a new kind of regulation which could force any member states to have any kind of measures regarding border patrolling, which is against the willingness of that given countries.
Countries will not accept that their neighbours, because of the complete free movement, are able to make policy decisions on immigration, which not only change the ethnic composition and religious composition of the country that makes the decision, but also of everybody else. In this situation, fundamental sovereignty considerations will, I believe, arise, and people will say, we alone can decide who is going to be in our country. And if you accept that millions and millions and millions of people, many of whom will move on, we're not going to accept that. So I think it is potentially very, very threatening to the free movement of people principle in the European Union. They have to regain control over their borders and then decide how many asylum seekers in aggregate they're going to take. I don't think the quota system, by the way, can be made to work ultimately, because you can put people wherever you want, but they can move. So the quota system, which is what Juncker is proposing, everybody takes, is sort of misleading. It's not the way this thing can work. It has to be done in aggregate in an agreed way. It's a very big problem politically for the whole of Europe, and Britain is just a small part of that.
This comes as only around 200 asylum seekers out of a proposed 160,000 have been relocated from those frontline states to other EU nations.
British Prime Minister David Cameron was the centre of attention at a summit of EU leaders in Brussels on Thursday. He wants the European Union to be reformed in 4 key areas. Most controversially, he would like to limit migration flows within the bloc and introduce restrictions on certain benefits that can be claimed by migrants. The reforms are being negotiated in the context of a UK referendum in 2017, which could see Britain leave the EU.
Leaders voiced their concerns, but also demonstrated willingness to look for compromises. Building on this positive debate, We agreed to work together to find solutions in all 4 baskets raised by Prime Minister Cameron.
Cameron said progress had been made at the summit regarding his reforms campaign, but admitted a lot more negotiating is required. Many believe that the issue was merely used as a smokescreen to divert attention away from the EU's failure to help desperate Syrian refugees who are seeking asylum in the 28-member bloc.
We issued a report only this week, which is documenting the fact that the Turkish authorities are forcibly returning Syrian and Iraqi refugees. They are also using arbitrary detention and a raft of other human rights violations. What's most worrying is that there is a clear nexus between the EU action plan and this further clampdown of refugees and migrants in Turkey.
EU leaders have agreed in principle to strengthen border controls, but again, campaigners say the heads of government have got their priorities all wrong and are turning their backs on a growing humanitarian crisis. EU leaders agreed months ago to relocate and settle 160,000 refugees, mainly in Greece and Italy, to other member states in the bloc. So far, just 200 have been relocated. Eurosceptics say this fact tells you everything you need to know about just how dysfunctional the European Union is. Imagine the statistic you read out. They agreed a couple of months ago 160,000 to relocate 160,000 desperate refugees who are mainly in Greece and Italy, and they were supposed to be moved and settled to other member states in the bloc, the other 26 member states, and so far only 200 have been resettled. It's a terrible statistic. You mentioned about the hotspots as well. These are the areas, the key areas where most of the refugees are arriving into EU territory, and these hotspots were agreed 6 weeks ago, and yet still only one, I think, has been created now in Lesbos, on the Greek island. They're trying to get others created, but it's just happening at a snail's pace. And all the while, the conditions are getting worse in many EU countries. The inclement weather is here because we have the winter here, and also outside, along the bordering countries outside of the EU as well, the weather is deteriorating. And these desperate refugees are trying to get into the European Union under international laws and agreements. They have a right to apply for asylum. They have a right to seek asylum here. And yet we're hearing from the likes of Amnesty International that the EU is cooperating with Turkey and giving Turkey money to push away refugees and really desperately need asylum. And we heard about, 6-7 weeks ago from the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair admitting that there is a direct link between the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was led, of course, by the United States and Britain, and the rise of Daesh. And of course, many of the people fleeing, millions absolutely, but around 1 million to the EU from Syria, they're fleeing Daesh. They're terrified of this terrorist organization. So the West admits that there's a link between the rise of Daesh, and of course, it's all linked to the refugee crisis. And yet the West is effectively turning their backs now on these desperate people trying to get into the European Union. You've got so many different types of politics. You've got 28 national governments. You've got coalition governments in certain countries. You've got all sorts of massive pressures. It's extremely complex, the European Union. And I'm afraid to say that's why it's so dysfunctional.